Amen. If you were a person who was inclined to mathematics and you counted verses and things, the verses in the gospel that we got that related to the birth narrative of John the Baptist actually exceed the amount of space and verses that Luke spends telling us about the birth of Jesus. That kind of surprises you, doesn't it? John gets 24 full verses to explain his birth. Jesus only gets 21. So what does that tell you about John the Baptist? And you think about it, Mark didn't bother to tell us anything about the birth of Jesus, so what do we do with that? But why, you have to ask yourself, do we get so much time expended by Luke and effort in telling us about the birth of a guy that we Christians have firmly sort of placed in the background, in the sidelight? He sort of stands on the edge of the stage between the Old Testament and the New. And you know, in the 1960s when we used to sing about love, we all loved John the Baptist because he looked like the people we saw in the streets, right? crazy clothes and long hair. He kind of became a cartoon character, if you will, and we just safely put him on the shelf and said, we don't need to worry about John the Baptist anymore. We've got him figured out. The early church didn't have it so easy. In actual fact, in the first 100 years or so after Jesus' death and resurrection, there were still churches in modern-day Turkey that were dedicated to the proposition that John the Baptist was the Messiah and not Jesus of Nazareth. So we would do well maybe to have a sort of second thought about the importance of John the Baptist. Clearly, he's a compelling character and somebody we should try to spend some time trying to figure out. Luke clearly had an agenda when he wrote his gospel. Of course, he was trying to give us something of just the basic history, bare bones, the events that had been accomplished amongst us by God. Luke also, I think, by spending 24 verses on the birth of John the Baptist, wants to give us something about the relationship that existed between John the Baptist and Jesus. By rights, they're cousins. Luke wants us to know something about their respective ministries, their common early life, their families, their faith. Both of them are nurtured in the very bosom of their faith. Luke wants us, I think, to know something about Elizabeth and Zachariah, John's parents, Jesus' aunt and uncle. The whole thing is simply not just the story of John the Baptist and Jesus of Nazareth. It's a bigger story that Luke puts into its place in the history of the world and the history of the faith of God's people. And while 24 verses might seem like a lot to devote to John the Baptist, the sum of the matter really is that his birth and these verses of Luke's gospel point us to the Son of Mary, to Jesus, which when we get to the reading of Acts, which Luke, of course, also wrote, he kind of makes it crystal clear that John's place is, in fact, as the precursor, the one who warms the stage. He's the opening act, as it were, and not the headliner or the tale. But Luke concludes in the gospel with these words, the child grew and became strong in spirit, and he was in the wilderness until the day he publicly appeared to Israel. And here's where I wonder, wilderness, camping, is kind of the same. One should take a backpack with you if you're going to go wander around in the wilderness for any length of time. And interesting, John's not the first prophet to go out into the wilderness. It seems that all of the prophets of Israel all left the center and went out to the edge, out to the wilderness. Elijah was a Tishbite. He wasn't part of the inner circle, wasn't part of the club. Moses, who was part of the club, walked out into the wilderness and led God's people out there with him on their way from Egypt to Israel. John lived in the wilderness. At about 30 years of age, Jesus felt the pull, put down the tools in the workbench, maybe in his father's carpentry business, and walked out into the wilderness. I wonder if Jesus took a backpack. But he went out to the wilderness and joined his cousin John. There's something, I think, to be learned by the fact that God always seems to choose to disrupt and to lead God's people from the outside in. And when we think about the church, if God's going to come at us from the outside in, then we best keep our boundaries of who's in and who's out, and our boundaries against the world permeable, because otherwise God hasn't got a chance to get in here and get at us. Because God's going to come from the outside in. It seems to be the case anyhow. In a rural southern town in the United States way back in the 1950s, there was a town that sort of existed in a great big red clay bowl. The center of town was in the bottom of the bowl, and then on the outer edges, the town grew out from that center place. The water supply in that town was newly controlled by a public utilities commission that had been created. This is, we take all of this stuff for granted, but there was a day before that thing called the PUC. Residents now got their water right to the house. Came in a pipe. They put a meter on it, and you paid a monthly bill in order to have water come to your house. They had 3 artesian wells prior to that, one on either side of town and one in the middle, right in the center of town. Since they now had public water for all the folks that can afford it, they capped the 2 wells on either end of town. They kept the one in the center. And of course, that was for the poor people to get to. And into town they came. All the black sharecroppers, all the black farm employees that worked out in town, all those people whose poverty made the people who lived in the town rich, because they all benefited from the poor wages that were being paid for these folks. And of course, it's 1950s and it's the southern United States, and we know that it's a segregated community. The white folk lived in town, the black people lived on the edge of it. Prolonged drought happened. The wells started to dry up, but they still came into town. The well in the center of town was lower, right? Still had water. They could still get it. And from his study window, the much respected senior pastor of one of the churches in town could see the church that existed across the street from him. It's the good old days, it's a small town. There's a center intersection in town, and there's the city hall, the post office, and 2 churches. Yeah, that's how it goes. All the important things are right there, right in the center of town. And so from his office, he could easily watch as the caretaker from the church across the street came out with a couple of workers, and they capped the well. Turned out that the church owned the well. It was on their property. And the poor people were coming to the church, and they were drawing water, and they were a nuisance. They left their garbage there. And so they decided they'd solve their problem, and they capped the well so nobody could get water there anymore. So that meant all the poor people in town, and on the edges of town, had to go to the river. They just had to draw their water from the river and hope they didn't get sick. The senior pastor of that congregation, as he sits in his study on a Monday morning, is faced with 2 competing stories about what he's going to do next. There's the Christian story that he preached every Sunday morning and his congregation presumed to profess, which seemed in rather sharp contrast to the idea that it would be okay to cap a well that poor people needed to come to draw water from that was fit to drink. The pastor was at a loss. It wasn't his church that capped the well. You have to understand that, right? It's the church across the street that did that. It wasn't his team, it was the other team. And yet he rightly feels the pull of the gospel that he reads and that he preaches that says the capping of that well is just wrong. The story of the town and maybe even of the 2 churches, however, made the whole notion of capping the well seem perfectly reasonable, perfectly acceptable. I mean, after all, those people were being a nuisance. Cap the well, solve the problem. All seems like a thing a respectable group of people would do. But it doesn't fit into the story of John the Baptist or Jesus of Nazareth, both of whom clearly we all know would not have abided the capping of that well. But to speak out, to get out from behind the window and out of the study and go across the street and talk to his neighboring minister would be to step out from the comfort and the security of the center of town. He'd have to step out and upset his friends. He'd have to challenge their assumptions. He'd have to go out into the wilderness. One wonders what the pastor did. We all know what John the Baptist would have done. Another more subtle take on the same dilemma. When the Roman Catholic sister who'd been the associate minister decided that she was going to leave the campus ministry to which she had devoted a good 15 years of her life, the search for her replacement began. The incumbent priest, while officially the senior minister, wishing to see that the new associate hired would have a new job description that closely reflected the sort of collaborative leadership model that he and the people at the campus ministry had been developing over the years, decided that he would call the community together, and in consultation, they would write a job description and they would write the ad that they would post out into the world to get people to come and apply for the job. It was all very collegial and a kind of a flat hierarchy that they had created, and he wanted to make sure that the hiring of a new person would reflect all that. And so they did all those things. They held the meetings and people talked and they shared their dreams, and around the point of the process where things were just about finished, and an interesting thing happened. Although they developed the description of the job together and would be in charge together of selecting the candidate who would ultimately get the job, they'd interview and they'd decide. The members of the community council that had been created decided and left it up to the clerical leadership to place the job ads, to put the ads in the appropriate places so people would see it. Now, the priest did what lots of us clergy do. He just did the easy thing because he had 100 other things he needed to do. So he just placed the advertisement in a sort of trade journal, right, for campus ministry. The kind of thing that nobody reads. There was a nun on staff as well, and she placed it in a publication aimed at members of her particular religious order. Just her order, not any others. So 6 weeks later, the whole group gets together again, and they're going to go through all the job applications, because, there's probably a lot. They're a bit disturbed to discover that they had a grand total of 2 applicants for the job, and neither one of them, by the resumes that they had in front of them, were anywhere near appropriate for the position. They asked why the ads hadn't been placed in publications that people actually read. A little wider circulation, after all. And after a bit of a disturbing meeting, they decided they'd just start over again. And new ads were placed in national publications that people actually do read. And a month later, the group again met, and this time they had 18 people applying for the job who all looked like they could probably do it. And then they had to make a decision. In a whole lot of ways, that's a really good process, start to finish. The members of the community were really pleased, but they'd learned something about themselves in the process of the thing. They'd uncovered a kind of passive clericalism. It wasn't so much on the part of the priest or the sister that put the ads in the wrong places, but on the rest of the folk. Because they just let the priest and the nun do it because that's the way they always did it. It was the customary thing to do. Just let the clerical types take charge. And the lay folks kind of withheld their leadership on what turned out to be the crucial matter of the piece. Who would put the ads, and into what kind of newspapers and journals those ads would go? The group agreed that really there was no bad guy in the story. They'd just simply fallen back into the way things had always been done. Back into the center of their tradition and into its bosom, into the patterns of hierarchy that it had always existed. Patterns in which they had intentionally tried to renounce in order to produce the job description and in the way they lived together, and yet they found themselves falling back into. See, the truth is, it's really not easy to step out of the center and go to the wilderness. We don't own backpacks. and it's been a long time since we had to pack one. And truth is, it's not easy for leaders, and it's not easy for folk to step out of the center and go to the edge and go to the wilderness to hear what God's got to tell us. The old patterns and the old ways have deep roots in us. And my goodness, they're comfortable. It doesn't mean we couldn't change. It just means we have to be intentional about it. The 2 stories both come from a book entitled Leading God's People, Ethics for the Practice of Ministry by a guy named Richard Bondy. I always liked his name because when I was a kid, the best pizza place in town was called Bondy's. So when I happened upon Richard Bondy, I figured, he must be a good writer because the pizza was always good. No relation, but just how my crazy brain works. Bondy wrote these words as well in his book. He says, a life formed too strongly by the forces of the center can shape ministers and people with a disposition to complacency. Complacency tempts to withhold leadership because it leads us to close our eyes to problems that we just rather not look at. It tells us everything is running smoothly and prevents us from checking in with dissenting voices who usually reside at the edge of our communities. When we allow ourselves to become complacent, we enter a deadening self-deception that requires us to conspire with the status quo, lest we disrupt the arrangements that support our complacency. The senior pastor at the church in rural southern United States, 1950s, closes the blinds, goes back to his morning coffee and his newspaper. He turns his back on the people he sees watching their only source of clean water be shut off in the name of respectability. The selection committee members at the campus ministry just shake their heads. They interview the two unsuitable people, pick the best of the two, and go home and wonder why they bother with the church anymore. We all know we've been called to do better than that. That's why we remember the example of John the Baptist. John the Baptist was born into the very center, into the very heart of his community. In our day, John the Baptist grew up going to the early service from page 67 in the Book of Common Prayer, and by the time he was 18 years old, he knew every word off by heart. And not only did he know him, he loved him. Right? And that's all of us. You and I were born into the bosom of the Anglican tradition, I'm willing to bet.